Hello, viewers, and welcome to the first instalment of a new series titled Watchtower in Focus. Now, the point of these episodes is to give special attention to particular news stories that may pop up from time to time. I've been trying to do it just through normal videos, but I figure some of these stories are so important that they deserve to be given closer attention with the aid of guests. So in this episode, my guests and I will be discussing the Fessler case. Stephanie Fessler was 14 years old when she began to be molested by a Jehovah's Witness woman, Terry Monheim. Monheim was convicted for her abuse of Stephanie in 2011, but recently Stephanie filed suit against Watchtower for its part in covering up the abuse. At the trial for all 4 days before the case settled was one of my guests this evening. First of all, though, let me introduce our first guest, a good friend of mine who JW Survey readers will know as the website's editor, Covert Fade. Covert operates under a pseudonym due to the threat of shunning and has already been interviewed on this channel. So welcome, Covert.
Hey there, Lloyd. It's good to be back.
It's great to have you with us. And by the way, if you have Twitter, what's your Twitter handle, Covert, if anyone wants to follow you?
I am at Covert Fade.
Well, that's easy. So welcome, Covert. But I want to give a big welcome to my second guest, who JW Survey readers will know as John Redwood. John is the assistant editor at JW Survey. And the reason I'm so excited to have him on this video, well, there's 2 reasons. Firstly, this is the first time I've interviewed John because he too operates under a pseudonym due to the threat of shunning. But John has been doing, despite all of that, John has been doing some sterling work, really investigative journalist work on the Fessler case. So he is the only journalist, for want of a better word, who was in attendance at all 4 days of the trial, and he's writing about the what came about at the trial on JW Survey. So I'm thrilled that he can be part of the inaugural episode of Watchtower in Focus. John, welcome.
Thank you, Lloyd. Great to be here. And hello,
I've obviously got to remember to call you John, and not your real name, which Covert and I know because we all talk to each other all the time. So I will do my very best to uphold your pseudonym, John.
Thank you very much.
Saying
Great
it lots of
here.
times, John. So, without further ado, let's get on with the questions. So the first question, John, is how did you come to hear of this case and what motivated you to attend the court proceedings?
Yeah, this is a very interesting story. The case first started coming on our radar about over a year ago when we covered an article at JW Survey, which Trey Bundy, the investigative journalist, covered. And that was an article on the Stephanie Fessler versus Watchtower case. And in that article, the case was not going to trial at that point. However, there was a massive fight going on between Watchtower and the plaintiff's legal team as to the location where the trial would be held. And originally, the legal team for Stephanie Fessler, who is the victim in this case, wanted to file this case in Philadelphia, which was actually quite central not only to their offices, but to Watchtower, as well as some of the victims, or rather some of the people who were going to testify in this trial. So the thrust of that article from Trey Bundy, which we also covered, was the fact that Watchtower had intentionally tried to manipulate the court in order to get the trial transferred to York County, Pennsylvania. And the reason for that was that the backlog of cases in York County, Pennsylvania was so massive that it would have been years before we had ever seen this case go to trial.
That's quite a clever, quite a devious way of trying to stall things, isn't it?
It was, and so what happened was the trial was in fact transferred to York County. However, Stephanie's attorney, Jeffrey Fritz of the Soloff and Zervanos law firm, he decided to file an appeal to the transfer of venue. And when he filed an appeal, he went before a judge, and the judge agreed that this was a tactic which was not related to the trial itself or the convenience of those in York County, where the witnesses were located. But the judge agreed that this was a stall tactic. In fact, Attorney Fritz told me that when he called York County, they couldn't even give him an answer on when it would be possible to get this trial before a jury. So the judge said...
I seem to remember actually sorry, I was about to say, John, but I seem to remember the judge actually labeled this behavior abusive.
Correct.
And which was the phrase that I think we used in our headline and that Trey Bundy used. But the judge just didn't think this was a legitimate tactic. That according to the judge, Watchtower's behavior in this particular instance was abusive and quite despicable.
Yeah, Watchtower tried every trick possible in this case. They tried to claim that the witnesses were much closer to York County. The person who was the perpetrator, Terry Monheim, was actually closer to York County. So was Stephanie Fessler, the victim. They tried everything in the book, including those tactics, to get it moved. So yeah, the judge ruled that was an abuse of the system, and it was transferred back to Philadelphia. And at that point, we discovered that it was indeed settled for trial. It was going to be February 7th, 2017.
That's interesting, John. So now that we've learned a bit more about your participation and how the location for the proceedings was chosen, could you give us a bit more background to the case itself? Because obviously there was the criminal case, but this was now a civil case. So the guilt of Monheim had already been established. How did the proceedings against Watchtower arise?
Yeah, so I might even back up a step and say that it was very interesting that Terry Monheim, who was the perpetrator in this case, actually spent time in jail. And as you mentioned, there were criminal proceedings against her. So she spent approximately 3 months in jail, and she had about a 5-month probation added to her sentence. So she is also on Megan's list as a convicted sex offender, so she'll be on that list forever. And however, aside from the fact that this was prosecuted criminally, there was a really glaring and obvious problem with the way that the Jehovah's Witness organization handled this case, and it ran very parallel to the way that other cases have been handled. And that being that the elders in 2 different congregations, the Freeland, Maryland congregation as well as the Spring Grove, Pennsylvania congregation, were well aware that sexual abuse and allegations of sexual abuse had occurred. Instead of contacting Pennsylvania's Childline and the local authorities, police department, which is mandatory, and it was mandatory at the time of when they discovered this abuse, 2004 and 2005. Instead of contacting the authorities, the local elders contacted the legal department in New York, in Paterson, New York. Those men in the legal department did not contact the authorities, did not contact Childline. They did not advise the elders to contact the authorities or Childline. And as a result, the abuse not only happened in the year 2014, but it continued for 2 more years, and Stephanie Fessler was damaged for life. She suffers from extreme trauma, PTSD, nightmares, multiple symptoms, and she's been treated by a therapist as a result of her extensive relationship with Terry Monheim, which could have ended very quickly if the elders had reported this to the police. And unfortunately, because of Watchtower policy, they did not end this, and the abuse went further.
Right. Now, one thing, I mean, just astonishing really, that such a, as you say, such a straightforward case of addressing a criminal act when unreported and was therefore exacerbated. I should have just mentioned when we began that, John, you wrote quite a lengthy article. We were talking about this before we went on camera. It's, I think, is it 6,000 words, the article?
The most, yes.
Yeah,
that's correct.
But the fascinating thing is that it's had a record number of unique visits. Usually we're used to getting in the region of maybe 8,000 visits on a story that only XJWs are likely to know about. But in this case, was it over 11,000 visits that we had?
I think it was actually 14,000 in one day, for one day, not counting the follow-up days.
Right.
Yeah.
So phenomenal.
They're basically double the normal of visits per day. Yeah. Very impressive.
Absolutely astonishing. So, but the reason why is because essentially, I mean, there's very little media coverage on this. There's a brief article. Is it Penn? What was the name of the outlet? Penn Live. There's Trey Bundy's done a brief article on Reveal, but as we said before, you were the only reporter of any description who was there. Now, what readers probably won't know is that in addition to being there as an observer, you were also helping the plaintiff. You were helping the plaintiff's legal team. So what can you tell us about Stephanie's legal team and what help were you able to provide?
Yeah, so perhaps we can back up and discuss how that came about. One of the things that Watchtower has done over the course of nearly every civil case that they've ever had filed against them is that they have obstructed justice in every possible way. When documents are requested from the Watchtower, including letters to elders, they redact almost every single letter. And so when the Fessler case was filed, they began the research process of getting all of the letters that applied during the time period that Stephanie Fessler was not only abused, but when the elders were handling this case. So Jeffrey Fritz, attorney for the law firm of Soloff and Zervanos, what he did was begin the process of gathering all of this data. However, Watchtower did not yield those documents. And when they did yield the documents, they redacted nearly all of the documents. And I'll give you an example. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence in this case was the July 1st, 1989 the July 1st, 1989 Body of Elders letter that was sent to all elders, and it was a 6-page letter describing...
I think this letter also used in the Conti case as well?
Yes, it was. And this 6-page letter was a critical piece of evidence. In fact, it was, if it were not for two things, if it were not for the Zalkin, or rather the law firm that handled the Conti case, which I believe was Rick Simons, and for an XJW site which provides letters to elders for the public and has exposed all of these pieces of information which the law firm of Jeffrey Fritz was trying to obtain. If it were not for that, the Jeffrey Fritz and Stephanie Fessler would not have had the information that they needed to fully prosecute this case and show that the Watchtower was hiding such information. So in other words, wow. They actually told the judge during the trial that this was during an adverse inference motion, that they had received very little information from Watchtower, and when they did receive it, it was redacted. It was very similar to the other cases, from the Conti case to the Padron case to multiple other cases that are being handled right now in law firms across the U.S. So they were not getting the information until they found it from alternative sources such as XJW websites and also other law firms.
Isn't it ironic, though, that whenever you hear Watchtower talking about well, I embrace the word apostate, but I know a lot of people don't like that word. But whenever Watchtower talks about apostates, they talk about apostates being deceptive and misleading and deceitful and dishonest. And yet here we have, in a court of law, vital information that needs to be used and made available in order for justice to be served. And it's actually the apostates who are producing the factual information.
Yeah, that's correct. And this really flies in the face of Watchtower's accusation that apostates are mentally diseased and that they are full of apostate-driven lies, when in fact the law...
Making everything up.
Yeah, they really have been accused of making everything up. We just had a comment yesterday on one of our sites that... the person who wrote on JW Survey said that, look, my mom wants proof of this because everything is made up. She's claiming that the elders never had this information, or that they were not required by mandatory reporting laws to report the sexual abuse allegations to the police. But in fact they were, and we have it in writing that in fact during the time Stephanie Fessler was abused, beginning with 2003, 2004, up through 2005, absolutely there was a mandatory law in the state of Pennsylvania that all persons who are members of clergy or elders or anyone that is in a position of trust with children absolutely must report not only an actual case of sexual abuse, but an allegation of sexual abuse, even the most minor allegation, and that was made very clear in this trial. It was also made clear by Judge Collins, who presided over this case.
I think that the interesting thing to me about this is the behavior of Watchtower here, because you can almost hear out, you can understand how a very indoctrinated Jehovah's Witness would try and defend this behavior. But if you were to replace the words Jehovah's Witnesses with another religion, say Scientology or the Catholic Church, and then a Jehovah's Witness was to see a news article that said the Catholic Church was brought to trial, but they wouldn't provide any documents, and then when they did, all the documents were redacted, and then they tried to move the trial to another venue to delay it for years, and the judge said that was abusive. That witness would say, "Oh, that's terrible behavior. That that religion or that organization is behaving as though it's got something to hide. It sounds really guilty." But then if you were to say that's actually Watchtower that did that, then, well, they'd either start trying to defend it or they might maybe get a bit of cognitive dissonance. But it just, to me, really illustrates how the Watchtower very much has one face for the witnesses. The witnesses see one side of it, but this other side of the way the organization behaves, this kind of secretive, manipulative, abusive side, is something that most Jehovah's Witnesses simply aren't aware of. And I think it's one of the things that is, unfortunately for Watchtower, coming more and more to the fore as more of these trials happen. I think we're going to see this bad behavior in the courtroom leaking out more and more into the Jehovah's Witness community.
And actually one of the reasons why I was so keen to do this video, in fact, was because the internet now makes it possible for this information to come to light. And I feel as though, the case ultimately settled, and as a result of that, we can't know all of the details, at least not from Stephanie's side. We'd never hear them from Watchtower's side. And as I've said already, there's very limited media coverage. And I was just concerned that if we didn't do a video and if we didn't talk about this as much as possible while it's still fresh in John's mind and while we still have all our notes to hand, it would just get buried by the sands of time.
Yeah, I think it's important for this information to get out there, and I think it's important for it to be extremely accurate and precise, which is why the quotes that you'll find on JW Survey are direct quotes from the courtroom itself. They're going to be direct quotes in future articles as well on what the Watchtower attorneys' tactics were, not just commentary on that, but actual quotes on what these men said and what arguments they were trying to use. I'll give you one example at the very outset of the trial.
Well, probably that segues nicely with my next question. So, I was going to ask you what kind of defence did Watchtower's legal representation offer, and also were they all Jehovah's Witnesses? So I'll now let you carry on and answer that question as well.
Sure. The defense was made up of a large team of attorneys. There were three primary attorneys involved in this case because there were actually four defendants, and I'll give you a list of the defendants. The first defendant was the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York. The second was CCJW, which is the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. And the third was the perpetrator, Terry Monheim herself. And the fourth was the Spring Grove Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. So what I can tell you is that Watchtower had a representative from Paterson, New York, which is the home of their legal department, and his name was John Miller. John Miller has presided over other cases in reference to defending Watchtower on trial. Then we had a man by the name of Louis Lombardi, who was a person representing the CCJW, Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. Then at the third chair, we had Mr. Judd Aaron, or Judson Aaron, who is a very famous trial lawyer from Pennsylvania, and he was representing the Spring Grove Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. The fourth,
and he wasn't a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah, that's correct. So at the beginning of the trial, we actually asked those questions. We knew that John Miller from Watchtower was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, very long-time member of the organization. Secondly, we did not know about Mr. Louis Lombardi from CCJW. Third, we did for a fact know that Mr. Judd Aaron was a very high-priced attorney from Pennsylvania who had been hired to defend the Spring Grove congregation, where there was a tremendous amount of blame to be laid upon the elders, since none of those elders reported this to the police. And finally, Terry Monheim did not have a defense attorney present, and it was in fact a case really against Watchtower, the elders, as well as CCJW, not so much a case against Terry Monheim.
So that was the makeup of Watchtower's representation, but you were just going to answer before about how they dealt with one of their defences. So how would you summarise their ability to defend the organisation against the accusations they were up against?
Yeah, so I guess first I'll mention that by the end of the trial, we discovered that the second attorney, which was Mr. Louis Lombardi, was in fact one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Although when I personally asked him if he was, he denied answering the question. In fact, his answer or reply to me is, was that relevant or germane to your case? And he refused to answer the question. We found out later that he is indeed one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And the interesting thing is that his presence was actually necessary not only to defend CCJW, but it was necessary in a legal manner. There's a legal term called pro hoc vice, which allows an attorney to practice in a state that they are not licensed in. So in the case of John Miller for Watchtower, he was not licensed to practice in the state of Pennsylvania. So the only way for him to practice was for him to use pro hoc vice under the legal guardianship of this Mr. Louis Lombardi, who was at the same time a Jehovah's Witness defending the CCJW. So that'll give you a little bit of information that two of the three people sitting at the table were in fact Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were defending the organization. There were additional counselors there that worked for Judd Aaron, as well as a few representatives of Watchtower that sat second chair and did not speak during this case.
May I ask you, John, why was Lombardi, do you think, so reluctant to confirm his identity as a Jehovah's Witness? It seems that it would be a very strange thing for him to not want to disclose, since there are other witness lawyers operating openly on that team. Do you have any idea as to why that was?
Yeah. Well, I could tell you what my feelings are on that. When I approached Mr. Lombardi, the case had just settled moments before, and following that case, Watchtower wanted to interview the jury, and so did I. So Watchtower got their chance to interview the jury as to what their feelings were on the case now that it is settled. During that interview, I began asking questions, and Mr. Lombardi started taking notice of my presence. And he was a little upset that I was noting and recording the session, which was a public session with the jury. And we actually ran into each other on the elevator literally 5 minutes later, going down to exit the court building, which was the Central City Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. When first he asked me, who was I from? And when I answered him, then I asked him, is he one of Jehovah's Witnesses? His response was, is that germane to your case? And so we left it at that. I think Mr. Lombardi was upset with the ruling. I think he was upset at my presence, and I don't think he liked me asking questions. And obviously it was a loss for the defense team. It was a loss for his organization, Christian Congregation, loss for the Watchtower. And I'm sure he would admit that he's a witness to other persons, but not to me. And this was the first time he had spoken during the trial. He never spoke a single time. It was all of the testimony took place under the plaintiff's attorneys, as well as Judd Aaron for the Spring Grove congregation, as well as John Miller for Watchtower. They did all the talking.
So, John, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so you asked about the defense. The defense started with opening statements, which was on day one, February 7th. And from the very beginning, the defense had two opening statements, one from Judd Aaron for Spring Grove, and the other was John Miller for Watchtower. And immediately they came out of the gates accusing Stephanie Fessler of being a liar. In fact, they called her a liar standing 2 feet from Stephanie Fessler, whose back was turned as these lawyers faced the jury in a small courtroom in Philadelphia. So,
what an astonishing way to treat an abuse victim.
It was. But these are attorneys. Their job was to win their case, to defend the Watchtower, and unfortunately, Stephanie had to sit there and listen to these men accuse her of being a liar. And of course, she wasn't a liar. And in fact, what was interesting was that in opening statements, Watchtower's attorneys stated that the abuser in this case, Terry Monheim, wasn't even going to show, that she wasn't going to be there to defend herself or give testimony. And the interesting thing was that Terry Monheim did indeed show, and she did indeed give her testimony. She admitted...
So they were the liars.
Yeah, they admitted to... I'm sorry, Terry Monheim admitted to everything. She was remorseful. She had served her time in prison. She is on the Megan's list, and we can't defend what she did. It was wrong. What was even more wrong was Watchtower's defense of the elders for not contacting the authorities. It made things much worse.
But at least she wasn't accusing the plaintiff of lying. At least that can be said for her.
No, that's correct. She corroborated Stephanie Fessler's story 100%. There was no doubt that this case was going downhill before the jury heard a single witness testify. In opening statements, they accused her of being, accused Stephanie of being a liar, which was horrible. They also said Terry Monheim wasn't going to show, and I asked the defense attorneys, why in the world Watchtower would even attempt to say that a witness was not going to show, and they were perplexed. They didn't have an answer for what that legal strategy was all about, because it shot them down and made them look foolish, to be quite honest.
And that seems to be a recurring theme. I mean, not to sort of derail too much, but I think as we're going to see, it's very strange decisions or things that would appear to me, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but things that would appear to me just to be ranking competence appear to riddle what Watchtower was attempting to do in the courtroom. I know we're going to come onto it as you continue to talk about it, John, but the more I find out about the way Watchtower behaved in this courtroom, the more it just seems like they were the Keystone Cops of lawyers.
Yeah.
Some of the things they got up to in this case.
Yeah, there were quite a few. They attempted on multiple counts to raise objections, and 99% of their objections were overruled by the judge. And those objections included multiple cases of First Amendment claims that they wanted to suppress information based on First Amendment. They also tried to suppress all of the Watchtower and Awake articles that were used by the plaintiff in this case to demonstrate what the Watchtower policy's teachings were. They had so many Awake articles that Watchtower's attorney, John Miller, said that they were putting the religion on trial. And of course, the judge overruled that objection and allowed them to use all the evidence that had been presented for this case.
So, John, you mentioned that right out of the gate, as it were, there were underhanded tactics that were pursued. I'm just wondering, for the benefit of viewers, whether you'll give us a brief summary of what happened on each of the 4 days of the trial before the case was settled, because it's been reported that the trial was 5 days. In fact, I understand it was 4 days of trial, but there was one day that was where there was no proceedings due to the weather. So there were actually 4 days, and I'm wondering whether you can just summarise what those days looked like as the trial progressed.
Sure. Yeah, it was actually somewhat humorous. On the third day, we actually had a pretty bad snow and ice storm in the morning, but it cleared up pretty quickly, and we only had an inch or two of snow on the ground. And the next day, Judge Collins said that was a fake snow day, and I think she was a little upset that court didn't happen that day. But if we go back to February 7th, which was a Tuesday, the beginning of the trial, the first thing that happened in this trial was we had the finalization of the jury. And they had brought in 25 jurors in order to filter down the final 10 jurors which would be used. Normally in a case like this, there would be 8 jurors and 2 alternates. So they actually had to take 25 and bring them down to the number 10. So both sides asked questions, and the first question would be, here's the name of the witnesses, and then the second would be, here's the name of the attorneys involved. And do you know any of these people? And of course, the jury was required to raise their hand if they knew any of the people involved. And in fact, one of the jurors did raise his hand that he knew some of the members of either the Spring Grove congregation or the defense team, and one of the witnesses that they were going to call, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. So he was excused immediately. And then the rest of the jurors were questioned, and they ultimately were able to settle on 10 jurors, and they brought those jurors in. And but before they brought those jurors in, there were multiple pretrial motions, and you can read about those on JW Survey. There were at least 14 different pretrial motions where, for example, Watchtower was trying to get evidence excluded. They were also trying to get witnesses excluded. I'll give you an example. They tried to give, Watchtower tried to get Detective Lisa Layden excluded from testifying based on certain issues they felt that she was not qualified to testify on. She was, in fact, an extremely educated investigator with an experience of over 260 child abuse cases in her career, mostly in the state of Pennsylvania, in York County. So she had extensive experience in the reporting of and also the prosecuting of cases of child abuse. In fact, she was the one who had arrested and put Terry Monheim in jail. So she was clearly an expert witness, and Watchtower
tried to get her taken off as a witness.
They did. You can read a little bit about that on Survey, and we'll be talking about that some more. But we had opening arguments, not before the jury, but we had those motions. After the motions were complete, which, by the way, the Stephanie's legal team won 90% of those motions. At that point, the jury was brought in, and we began testimony. And testimony started on day one with Watchtower's key witness for the Watchtower organization and the Christian congregation. His name was Thomas Jefferson.
Hang on. Is this the same as the president?
Yeah, I thought it might be. I thought it might be a good idea to say something along the lines of Thomas Jefferson had just ruined the Watchtower's constitution.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I'm just making sure. Yeah.
The other reason I'm laughing is because I think this man's name is going to become synonymous with Watchtower courtroom failure. For those of what I will say now, for those perhaps who are listening to this who haven't read the JW Survey article that John wrote, go read the JW Survey article on this particular topic. Read the account of Thomas Jefferson in full detail, and then you'll understand why I started giggling when John brought him up here, because it's quite a story. Anyway, sorry, back to you, John. Yeah.
Well, I think you summarized it well, and we could go on for hours if we discussed the testimony of Thomas Jefferson, and we won't do that here, but suffice it to say that he was one of the most curious, obfuscating. He was one of the most difficult witnesses I've ever seen in any cases that have been filmed on television for the public to view. I mean, you could not write a better story about a guy who was there to confuse, befuddle.
He was like a caricature of a bad witness, wasn't he?
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson's a member of the United States Branch Committee. That means that he is a Jehovah's Witness who has risen through the ranks of the organization, has served in positions like circuit and district overseer. Ultimately, he became a full-time Bethelite, which means he's a member of the headquarters staff. And I believe he's either residing in Patterson or in Wallkill, New York right now. But he was sent by the Watchtower organization to defend their policies, to explain what all their organizations were. And his testimony was extremely confusing. The first attorney to interview him was attorney for Stephanie Fessler. And this particular attorney was Mr. Greg Zeff, who was part of Stephanie's team, and he's an extremely experienced trial lawyer. Well, Mr. Zeff started questioning Thomas Jefferson, and from the moment he opened his mouth, his testimony fell to pieces, because he could not explain exactly what Watchtower, CCJW, the United States Branch Committee was in any coherent way, in any way that the jury could comprehend what he was saying. All the organizations are intertwined. It was intentionally confusing, and he did just a terrible job. And of course, we interviewed the jury later, and they told us what they thought of Mr. Jefferson. But you can read some of his testimony on JW Survey. But suffice it to say that he was, as one jury called him, a monkey wrench sent by the Watchtower organization to throw everything.
That's what a jury member said about
it. A jury member said that, yeah. We have that on record. A jury member, during the interview, which was 8 minutes long, at the moment this case settled, the jury were free to discuss the case. And during that interview, I asked the jury, what did you think of the testimony of Thomas Jefferson? And the jury exploded into just a cacophony of noise, laughter, derision. Every one of them wanted to tell their story about what they thought about Thomas Jefferson. And one man in the back stood up and said he was a monkey wrench and he was sent there to throw everything into confusion. And another woman stood up and said, well, who are the 15 men? And another woman standing right next to me, who was one of the jurors, said, we don't understand. What's Watchtower? What's CCJW? What are all these corporations? It was very confusing for the jury, and it was intentionally confusing, as they were trying to protect their interest and trying to throw the blame on the victim herself.
when you hear that the case was settled after only 4 days, I'm thinking something must have gone seriously wrong on days 3 and 4 for things to work out like that.
Right. So I think things went wrong before the jury heard a single word. But we had day 1 testimony of Jefferson. We had day 2 testimony also of Jefferson. We had 2 elders that testified that indeed they knew something was going on. At the very latest, by 2005, they were aware of a sexual relationship. They did nothing about it. And then we get to day 3. So we had a snow day on Thursday, which was the 9th, and then we had Friday. So we resumed trial on Friday morning, and we received the testimony of Detective Lisa Layden. Now, Detective Layden, as I mentioned, she's the one who actually dealt with this case, and she first learned around 2011 that there was an abuse that occurred. And she did not learn this from the elders, from the Watchtower organization. She learned it when, in her early 20s, Stephanie finally had the courage to tell her story, to go to the police. And as a result, Terry Monheim was arrested. She was sentenced to jail, and she was also placed on 5 years probation. And, of course, she's on Megan's list, as I mentioned earlier. So it really was only because Stephanie Fessler, at her early 20s, decided to come to the police and make her report that this whole crime was investigated and the perpetrator was put behind bars and was given 5 years probation after that. So aside from that, the elders were never going to contact the authorities.
So day 3 was the detective. Was the detective's testimony. Was there anyone else on day 3?
Right. So that was really it. So what we had was on day 3, following the previous day's testimony of the 2 elders, Detective Lisa Layden took the stand, and she was questioned by all of the attorneys involved, but they didn't actually finish with her on Friday, so she had to come back via telelink on Monday, which was the 14th. So
this was day 4.
That's correct. So on Monday, day 4, we had Detective Layden came back, completed her testimony and cross-examination, and then recross-examination by the plaintiff's attorneys. So we had a lot of back and forth. We had a lot of Watchtower attorneys trying to discredit Detective Layden. In fact, at one point, John Miller for Watchtower tried to get Detective Layden to admit that there were some possible circumstances related to Stephanie Fessler's relationship with Terry Monheim whereby she or the elders had no reason to contact the police. In other words, they were questioning her. Miller was questioning, was there any possible way that this holding of the hands or mother-daughter type kissing would not be an inference or an instance in which the elders should have taken notice and contacted the police. And Miller thought surely he could get her on that, and he did not. Detective Layden, under no circumstances, was going to capitulate, and she said that any instance that raises a suspicion or would rise to the level of abuse in any case needs to be reported to the authorities so that that can be properly investigated. And I was sitting just a few feet from Attorney Miller when he made this final stand against Detective Layden, and it was clear that all the air had gone out of his testimony, and he let out a huge sigh. And at that point, I think everyone knew, including the jury, that there was no way that the detective was going to admit that this is a matter that should not have been reported to the police. So that was the final day of testimony. On day 4, just around lunchtime, there was a stir of activity, and the attorneys were all called up to one of the upper floors in the City Hall courtroom, and we knew that something was going on between the defense attorneys and the plaintiff and her legal team. So within about 30 to 40 minutes, word came down that the case had settled for an undisclosed amount, and that Watchtower had essentially packed up his bags, had packed up their bags, and the only thing left to do was to interview the jury, and that was how it ended, with the interview of the jury.
So I guess, I mean, what you've just told us there paints a picture of really damning witness testimony. I'm just interested in as an observer to the case, why you think Watchtower settled so quickly after only, was it 3.5? Was it 4 days or three? It sounds like 3.5 days now.
Yeah, that's right. Technically, we even had a short day on Friday, and we resumed on Monday, which was, in terms of days, it was day 4, but that was really a half day, and the case was over, except for the jury interview. And
so how did it collapse so quickly, in your opinion?
So I would describe it as a collapse over 4 days, from the moment that Watchtower started losing their motions before the jury ever entered the room. And these motions were with regard to what they could present as testimony and what they could not present. They were also with regard to what the plaintiff's attorneys could present, such as the Watchtower articles, the letters to the body of elders. All of these things were an attempt. They even tried the clergy privilege argument, and that's another subject. But for most of our viewers, I think probably know what clergy privilege is, and this is where a member that is an elder or a clergyman, when a confession is made to a clergyman in private with no other parties present, and this is a confession of some sort of crime or some sort of sin, when that confession is made, there is an exemption, or, well, actually, what I should say is there is a law that says that the clergy is not obligated to report that matter to the police. Such as, for example, if, let's say, a person went to a clergyman or an elder and said, I have stolen $1,000 from the store where I work. The clergyman is not obligated to go to the police when, in most states, this person, in confession, telling no one else, says that he stole the $1,000. However, in cases of child abuse, nearly all states now have laws that are called clergy privilege exemptions, and those exemptions state that in the event that someone confesses a matter to a clergyman or an elder, and the matter is that a child was abused by that person confessing, then the clergy member or elder is exempt from the restriction on telling the police. So in other words, in most states, that member of clergy can then go to the police and say, a child has been abused and is in danger. I need to report an allegation or a confession. So in this particular case, before the trial ever started, there was never a clergy exemption that was available to Watchtower. However,
Watchtower were banking on that.
Watchtower still tried to use it both before the trial and at the beginning of pretrial motions and even during the trial. But the judge overruled that. In fact, in private chambers, when Watchtower first tried to use the clergy privilege claim, the judge said, well, under no circumstances is this clergy privilege. Because number one, they went after Stephanie. The elders went after Stephanie for an investigation. And when you have a private investigation that occurs, your clergy privilege goes out the window. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that multiple parties were involved. There were at least 8 to 10 elders, at least, in 2 congregations that knew of the confession or the sexual abuse, the sexual relationship that was occurring between Fessler and Mannheim at the time. So because these 8 to 10 men knew of this, and because the Watchtower organization's legal department knew of this, there no longer was any clergy privilege, because that confidentiality was null and void. There was no confidentiality And so on top of that, it was
didn't they? Sorry,
yeah.
didn't they first try to claim clergy privilege and then try to argue that elders aren't clergy? Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And this is another fascinating aspect of the case we're going to be covering on JW Survey. For 2 days of the trial, for 2 straight days, Thomas Jefferson was grilled on whether or not elders were clergymen. If you recall, he had to answer multiple questions. What's the CCJW? What is the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society? What are the U.S. branch committee members? What is the governing body? Then on top of that, they hit him really hard on what is the definition of clergyman. They put the definition of clergy up on the screen, and they asked Thomas Jefferson, are Jehovah's Witness elders clergy? And he said, no, absolutely not. Under no circumstances are Jehovah's Witness elders clergy. And he explained why. And he gave an incredible reason why they're not clergymen. And it was the most convoluted line of reasoning, which we're covering on Survey. So then he was on the stand day 2, and they asked him a second time. Mr. Greg Seff said, Mr. Jefferson, do you want to change your answer? And he put the definition of clergy up on screen a second time. Said, do you want to change your answer? Jefferson said, no, elders are absolutely not clergymen under any circumstances. So we had a day off for snow. We came back on Friday, which was the 10th of February. At that point, the judge announces, we understand that the defense has a statement that they would like to make. And so the entire courtroom heard the statement that Jehovah's Witnesses and the Watchtower organization have now agreed that elders are clergymen.
Amazing.
That is, there's so many, there's 3 points that I take away from this particular aspect of this particular debacle. The first is that, as I know you brought up in the JW Survey article, John, the legal principle of estoppel prevents you from taking one point of view but then switching to another if that suits your defense better. So in other words, Watchtower aren't allowed to walk in and say, we claim clergy penitent privilege, but we're not clergy.
Right.
But that's what they were trying to do, and the fact that they were doing it, I think, speaks realms to their desperation and the kind of the competence of their defense. The second aspect of that, I mean, I'd not heard that before, but to hear them so blatantly, because Jehovah's Witnesses are very, I remember from my times being a witness, adamant, no, we don't have clergy because clergy are bad. The concept of a clergyman is quite tainted in Jehovah's Witness thinking because, we don't have a laity in a flock, we're all brothers together. So to hear them, as you say, I mean, to hear them just simply suddenly switch and one it suits their defense better and agree that they are clergy is actually quite jaw-dropping. It kind of shows them throwing ideology out of the window in order to try and get a better legal settlement. The third thing is that, as you said, that the clergy penitent privilege would not apply here anyway. The legal state would be mandatory reporting. Well, in the Jeffrey Jackson's testimony before the Australian Royal Commission, where there currently was not mandatory reporting, he was swearing that, well, if you just make reporting mandatory, of course we will report. We really want the Royal Commission to recommend.
Please force us to do what we want to do.
Exactly. So, but here we have a country, or in Pennsylvania, where those situations were enforced, where they do have a duty to report, and they're trying everything they can not to do it. So this, to me, Jackson, when he was appearing before the Commission, was either lying, or the Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia are completely separate from the Jehovah's Witnesses in America, which we know they're not. I mean, it seems to me fairly obvious that on one hand, Watchtower's begging for mandatory reporting is an excuse for what it hasn't reported before. But on the other hand, as soon as it gets that mandatory reporting, tries to weasel out of it in any particular way it can. And secondly, it seems like they can't get over their own ideology to fight a court case, because if you are going to go into a court and claim we didn't report because we have clergy penitent privilege, but then spend 2 days denying that you have clergymen, it's almost like they can't decide which ideological position to fall into. It's so muddled and confused. it feels like we kind of got a chance to peel back the kind of the plaster on the wall and find that it's absolutely cuckoo bananas in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And that really goes back to Lloyd's earlier point as to when this trial started collapsing. You could see it collapsing from the very beginning, but the first 2 days of testimony where they claimed that they were clergy, and then you get to the third day of testimony where they said, well, we're making an admission, we're not clergy. Moments later, Detective Lisa Layden took the stand, and she testified that there were no circumstances under which they should not have reported, that every incident that was in writing documented should have been reported to the authorities and to Childline. When you take that together with her final testimony and cross-examination on Monday the 14th, you put all that together, and it was pretty clear that at that point, and we know this later, that the jury had no question in their mind that this case was open and shut, and that they were going to find for the plaintiff. The question was, how much? And that really gets into a question that the jury couldn't answer. But I'll tell you what was very interesting was the fact that during the jury interview, the very first question that was asked was that John Miller of Watchtower of Patterson Legal Department asked the jury right to their face, how much would you have found for the plaintiff if you had
Was
gone
this in the courtroom? Sorry, I'm just trying to frame
Yeah.
the backdrop to this conversation. Was this actually in the courtroom, or was this in kind of the corridors outside the court?
It was in the corridors or hallways direct
Right. Okay.
5 feet from the courtroom.
Because you sent some pictures, which obviously I can't show, but I remember you kind of sneakily sending 1 or 2 pictures, and one of them showed a really interesting conversation in one of the corridors.
Right. So we may be able to use that because I believe it's a public space and we're allowed to record there. But,
Sure. Okay.
So
Okay. If I can use it, I'll show it now. Sorry, carry on, John.
yeah, in the photo you'll see on the left you'll see the Watchtower attorneys, John Miller, as well as Mr. Lombardi, who is also a Jehovah's Witness. Of interest is the fact that the one attorney who was an attorney that's paid somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 a day for his services, not counting all of the pre-trial and post-trial work, Mr. Judd Aaron, he disappeared. He was nowhere to be seen.
He bravely run away.
He bravely ran away, but you have to understand he has no interest in the long-term well-being of Watchtower,
Of course.
because he was paid very well for his services.
He was a suit for hire.
He was, and he did everything possible. He was defending a guilty victim, and he was indeed a typical defense attorney. He was brilliant. He did everything he could. There was nothing else he could do. He left, and what it left was John Miller for Watchtower and Lombardi, along with the entire plaintiff's team, with Stephanie Fessler, the entire jury, the court officer, and myself. And we questioned the jury, and the first question that Miller asked was, how much would you have given the plaintiff if you had reached a verdict? He didn't say anything else at first other than how much money, how many dollars would you have given the plaintiff? And I really was sickened by that, because his primary interest in this was whether or not Watchtower rolled the dice in the right direction. Whatever the settlement amount, we don't know if it was $2 million or $20 million, but whatever the settlement amount, they wanted to know.
They wanted to know whether they'd got a bargain.
That's right. That's right.
Wow.
One of the reasons they wanted to know that is they have many upcoming cases. In fact, there was a case in Vermont that was scheduled.
Well, we'll get to that. That's not one of the next questions. I'm actually curious, though, because obviously there'll be lots of people listening in who are perhaps Jehovah's Witnesses themselves. They've been trained to be distrustful of apostate material. They will rightly be second guessing. I mean, I would second guess what we're saying here, because this is one person's recollections of what happened. Am I right in saying that there are in fact transcripts available of what happened on those days.
Yes, and I suspect that ultimately these are going to be well publicized. What I can tell you is that regarding this case, there are just under 3,000 pages of pretrial documents that are available to the public through Pennsylvania's court system. For a small fee, you can purchase those documents through Pennsylvania. And then the transcripts are currently being handled by the actual court reporters, who are the people who actually type those testimonies into the court record, and it takes them a little bit of time to process and then make them available. And those are rather expensive because the court reporters charge a much higher fee for either same day, next day, or for the first few weeks or months after the court has settled its case. So for our viewers who are interested in those, I will say that they will be available at some point. I just can't tell you from what source, but I can tell you that the reporting that we're doing on Survey is word for word on the testimony of what happened.
You were actually there, so and you're reporting on this fully mindful of the fact that somewhere there exists a word for word transcript, and I guess all we can tell viewers and JW Survey readers is that we will explore, as the JW Survey editorial team will explore whatever options we can explore to push those documents into the public domain. But for now, at least, we have your articles shining a light on what otherwise people just would not know anything about.
That's correct. And what I would say to any of our viewers who would like information on a specific section of the trial or has a question, to contact us at JW Survey, and we'll do everything possible to answer that question and give them the accurate information, because we absolutely don't want any misinformation out there in the public. We want this to be 100% transparent, and that everyone knows exactly what happened here and who testified.
So, John, I cut you off just as you were about to tell us about another case, a child abuse lawsuit in Vermont, and I was under the impression that you had been asked to assist the legal team in that case. So what's the latest on the Vermont case?
Right. So we actually just found out in the last 2 days that there was a jury trial scheduled for the beginning of March, and this was a completely separate, unrelated case where abuse had occurred. And there is some information available online regarding this case. We can give that information on JW Survey. But what I can tell you is that right after the Fessler case settled just 2 days ago, we found out directly from the legal team that Watchtower has indeed settled the Vermont case for another case. And I'd also like to mention that we have more cases on the horizon that we could even begin to discuss in this brief interview. We are seeing really the tip of the iceberg here.
But how interesting that there's been an immediate kind of domino effect with the next case settling before any testimony's even been heard.
Yeah, I find that really, I mean, it seems to me the timing for that is very, very interesting. I mean, my take on what I'm seeing, based on all the cases we've seen in the last few years, and the fact that this case, with the arguments that Watchtower tried to bring to bear, disintegrated so spectacularly, and then the Vermont case a couple of days later just settles before it goes to jury trial. It seems to me like we're seeing Watchtower's ability to fight these cases just disintegrate in real time. Because what we're looking at is, if you are, and I'm just going to say this, if you are a abuse survivor who was abused by a Jehovah's Witness, and you feel that the Watchtower organization was complicit or that their behavior contributed to your abuse in some way, now is the time to go get a lawyer, because you have a winning strategy. All you need to do is either get your lawyer to request certain documents from Watchtower, which Watchtower will refuse to provide, so the abuse, the infamous database. If you can get that, if you can get your lawyer to request that, well, Watchtower will refuse to provide it. They'll either be their defense will be thrown out and you'll get a settlement, or Watchtower will just settle the case to avoid having to deal with it. If you can try and get one of the governing body on the stand, Watchtower will either refuse it or they will get a settlement. If you can prove that they can't use clergy penitent privilege, you'll get a settlement. It seems to me that a legal team now could study all of the recent cases, very easily come up either with a strategy which will win, or at the very least a strategy which will force Watchtower to make a settlement rather than go to trial. And your case, it just seems to me that Watchtower is losing its ability to fight this in court. And it's astonishing to watch.
Wasn't there a child abuse commercial, TV commercial, with lawyers actively trying to find clients to represent? I just get the sense that the vultures are circling at this point, because even Watchtower realizes that they cannot defend this anymore.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One thing I'd like to say to your viewers and anybody who's watching is that I'm sure there's going to be people, particularly apologists, that really feel like the attorneys are taking advantage of Watchtower and they're circling like vultures. But I've met these men, and I think we've all talked to the various law firms, men like Irwin Zalkin and those who are fighting this on the East Coast of the United States, as well as men like Angus Stewart in Australia, who have questioned the highest level of the Jehovah's Witness organization. And I can tell you that these men are very sincere. They want nothing more than justice for their victims. Their victims have every right to say, you should have called the police. You should have called Childline. Why didn't Watchtower warn the elders, tell them to pick up the phone, call the police? These children have been victimized, and many others have been victimized because that perpetrator had never been apprehended, had never been dealt with. Even the suspicion of child abuse had never been dealt with. And the net result is that Watchtower has turned on the victims themselves. We have multiple cases where the victims have been either disfellowshipped or lost their privileges or treated like an outcast in the organization. So the real victims here are the victims themselves who never got justice from Watchtower. And these attorneys are doing their job. That's how our justice system works.
Allow me to just clarify that they're not. When I said the vultures are circling, that doesn't mean that they are, evil men. Like you say, they're sincere people who just happen to be on the winning side.
Right. Well, when you have
the other thing
when you have a dead argument,
is the sometimes you hear people, when we talk about the size of the settlements, which do sometimes run into millions of dollars. That is completely reasonable considering the damage that's been done. I remember hearing Irwin Zalkin talk about the kind of trauma and effect that the child abuse has on a victim, and it basically destroys the rest of their life. They end up often drug addicted. They have to spend huge amounts of money on counseling. It destroys their ability to form relationships. It's the equivalent if somebody, due to someone's negligence, ended up losing both their legs. People wouldn't think, it's unreasonable for you to get a few million for that, both to penalise the negligent party and to compensate you for the horrific life-changing injuries. Well, child abuse inflicts horrific life-changing emotional and mental injuries on somebody. And the amounts, because you do sometimes see Jehovah's Witnesses trying to, expressing disgust at the size of the settlements. Well, the size of the settlements are completely reasonable once you understand the kind of damage and also the kind of negligence that's involved in these cases.
And I have to pointing out as well that sorry, John.
No,
I was just going to mention that you do hear it every now and then. I've encountered it already with the Fessler case. You hear ex-JWs say, "Oh well, now that she's settled, justice won't be done," and implying that she's somehow taken the easy way out by settling. And my response has always been, listen, before you start accusing a child abuse victim of being some kind of sellout, walk a mile in their shoes, because as you say, Covert, they have been through a horrific experience, and they deserve the best outcome that suits them. And let's remember as well how long the Conti case dragged on for when that was appealed, and how draining that would have been on Candace Conti. And then you have someone like Stephanie Fessler, who has the opportunity to bring everything to an end straight away and get an outcome that means that she can have closure and move forward. I think that nobody can begrudge her that. And thanks to John being in the courtroom, in a way justice has been done already, because we're talking about this now, and we're talking about the fact that Watchtower's defence collapsed.
Yeah.
I agree.
And the additional point just to put on that maybe at the end is it's interesting to see Watchtower always say they trust Jehovah to vindicate his name and they could put complete faith and trust in him. Well, Watchtower clearly didn't trust Jehovah to vindicate his name in that courtroom.
Well, I can tell you a story about that when they're covert. We were about 2 days into trial, and Thomas Jefferson for Watchtower was on the stand being interviewed, being grilled. And one of the attorneys, and I won't say which one, but while he was being interviewed, one of the attorneys leaned over to me and he saw another man who was sitting in the defense side. This was somebody who had apparently come down from either Brooklyn or Patterson Bethel. He was with the defense team. He was a young man, probably in his 30s, and the attorney leaned over to me and said, "Is he praying?" And this person, during the testimony of Thomas Jefferson, was seen with his head down praying. And I thought that was significant because we have a man who was desperately praying for Jehovah's direction in this case, but the case was nothing but a blight against the Watchtower. They could have flipped it. They could have turned it around even before the trial began and said, "We're sorry. We made a mistake. We had a terrible policy, and here's what we're going to do to fix the problem." But they refused to do that. They prayed and prayed and prayed about this, even in public court. And they lost the case. And
which just highlights as well that these men really are deluded. They really do believe that they are defending Jehovah's organization, and in my opinion that goes all the way up to the governing body. It's the only way to explain how they are stubbornly clinging to this two-witness rule.
I'll tell you another thing that was very interesting was we talked about the attorneys and their sincerity in prosecuting this case. After the second day of testimony, I had a conversation with one of the trial attorneys who was interviewing these. He was the primary attorney interviewing the witnesses for Stephanie Fessler. And I had been helping him with some research. And we're still in the courtroom at this point. And we were talking about the differences between Watchtower and CCJW and the 15 men on the U.S. Branch Committee. And he turned to me and he said, "Why are they doing this?" Now, here's the attorney who is one of the most experienced trial attorneys, who is for the plaintiff, and he's grilling these witnesses, and he knows his stuff. He has all the information at his fingertips, and he has all of the XJW community helping him with information, with facts, and all of that's before the judge. But he turns to me and says, "Why are they doing this?" And it was tough to give him an answer, but the short answer is that they believe it. As you mentioned, Lloyd, there's a delusion that's happening there where they truly believe that they're governed by God and that these principles that go all the way back several thousand years into, archaic times, they're applying their version of the two-witness rule, and they refuse to give that rule up. And I thought it was really telling that the attorney just threw up his hands and said, "Why are they doing this?" And gave him the best answer I could, but I think we understand why.
Yeah. So John, you've obviously already written quite extensively on this case. Can you just let the viewers know what further articles they can expect? And I'm also interested in whether you can see yourself getting involved in future lawsuits in the same way as you did do with the Fessler case.
Right. So to answer your second question first, yes, I think that I will be involved in many of these cases. In fact,
take note, Watchtower.
well, we have many people that have reached out to us at JW Survey and from other angles, from other websites, from other activists who have raised awareness of this through articles like the ones that we publish on Survey and through posts on Facebook and recovery groups. These people have reached out to us and said, I was abused too, and I've never dealt with this, or I've never had an advocate, or this happened to me. How do I get help? So what our job is as activists is to sort of act as a liaison between the legal teams and those who are victims to help them get to the right attorneys, the people who are trying to prosecute these cases, and get some justice until justice is served. To answer your question about the articles, we're going to be seeing more articles in JW Survey covering day 2, 3, and 4 of the Fessler trial. We're also going to be seeing some specific topics covered, such as the Watchtower's argument that they are clergy or they're not clergy, as this is an argument that we've seen in other cases, some which have been settled, and one which went to trial. And really, I don't know if our viewers know this or not, but this is actually the first case that has gone to trial that has settled in the middle of trial. We're probably all familiar with the Candace Conti case. So we're dealing with 5 or 6 years ago. But this is the first time that Watchtower has agreed to go to trial, and after 4 days of testimony and having their complete collapse of their testimony, decided to settle the case. So in that sense, this is a groundbreaking case. And to your point earlier, Lloyd, yes, it's really up to Stephanie what she decided to do. It was the right thing. And not only did she get justice and not have to sit through 3 more years of appeals, but the Watchtower had to pay out. And they paid out in more ways than one. They not only had to pay out in terms of a vast settlement, but they also had to pay out in terms of information and negative publicity. We have 4 solid days of testimony proving that everything they said was not what most witnesses would ever believe in a million years they would do in a court of law. And so we have a lot of evidence that I think is going to be very useful in the upcoming years and in other cases as well.
Yeah. Well, all that really remains, John, is for me to, and I'm sure I speak for not just myself and Covert Fade, but for the vast majority of people who will be watching this video, all that remains is for me to give you heartfelt thanks for being diligent and conscientious and proactive enough to cover this case, because as it turns out, if you hadn't covered the case, we wouldn't really know much about it. And I think you've done a huge service by doing what you've done. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I think we're going to see a lot more people get involved in the future. And we're going to see a lot more coverage of this. And as you know, we're going to be seeing documentaries filmed on the subject, which include the tragic child abuse cases that we're seeing globally at this point. So, we're not out to destroy anyone in particular here. We really want the truth to be told, and the truth is the truth that Jehovah's Witnesses in general are not aware of. For the most part, they believe their organization is driven by God, and they're sincere individuals. But unfortunately, we have a very terrible situation, not only with child abuse mishandling, but with shunning and with other matters related to the witness organization. So it's our job to get the truth out and give people, accurate information.
Indeed. Well said. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for. I mean, what a great subject for the very first instalment of Watchtower in Focus. I can only hope that future episodes will live up to the standards that we have set this evening, and I'm sure that you guys will be back on in future episodes. But thanks so much for joining me for this episode. Viewers, I hope you have found this information interesting, and as I say on all my videos, thank you for watching.